Imagine a planet moving through space. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't chase other bodies or flash signals to be noticed. Yet everything that comes near it subtly changes direction. That is how real charisma works. Not as performance, not as effort, but as gravity. Most men were never taught this. Instead, we inherited a quieter belief, one so normalized it rarely gets questioned. The idea that attraction is built through visibility, through dominance, through cleverness, humor, or constant expression. That if you are not actively projecting something outward, you risk disappearing. Over time, this belief doesn't just fail to work. It exhausts. It drains men who are already carrying too much. Men who are trying to become more appealing by adding traits, instead of asking what internal noise might be interfering with their presence in the first place. Because charisma is not something you add. It is something that emerges when interference is removed. Think of still water. When the surface is calm, depth becomes visible. You can see farther down, not because the water is doing anything, but because it has stopped reacting to every disturbance. The moment the surface ripples with urgency or effort, depth disappears again. Many men mistake movement for depth, expression for substance, output for presence. And underneath that confusion is usually fear, unconscious fear, masquerading as expressiveness, fear of being overlooked, fear of losing relevance, fear that silence might be misread as weakness or emptiness. When that fear drives behavior, even sincerity begins to repel, not because it's wrong, but because it leaks need. This is the unspoken cost. When internal noise stays unexamined, men try to compensate externally. More talking, more explaining, more signaling, more effort. And paradoxically, the harder they try to be felt, the less grounded they feel in themselves. What gets lost here isn't attraction alone. It's self-trust. It's the ability to sit inside your own nervous system without managing how you're being perceived. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to bend trajectories. You already have mass. If any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with it. Because at the midpoint of this video, we'll expose one behavior most men consider neutral, shenjai polite, that actually collapses attraction almost instantly. There is a particular kind of effort that doesn't feel like effort from the inside. It feels reasonable, social, engaged, even generous. But from the outside, it registers as urgency. This urgency rarely comes from personality. It usually comes from history. Many men learned early, often without words, that attention was inconsistent. Sometimes available, sometimes withdrawn. Approval felt conditional. Love felt earned. In those environments, attunement becomes currency. You learn to scan, to adjust, to perform just enough to stay connected. Over time, this becomes automatic, and the original wound disappears behind competence. What remains is compulsion without context. From a nervous system perspective, this pattern lives less in thought and more in arousal. Chronic sympathetic activation, the body's readiness to respond, creates subtle signals that others pick up long before content matters. Slightly rushed pacing, a voice that doesn't quite land, eyes that search for feedback before a sentence finishes forming. None of this is dramatic. That's why it's so hard to see in yourself. This is what neuroregulation points to. Presence is not only what you say or how you say it. It's the state your body is broadcasting while you're saying it. When arousal stays high, attention leaks outward. The system looks for resolution through response, validation, reassurance. Not consciously, automatically. This is where the reversal happens. Trying harder does not increase presence. It fragments it. Effort aimed at being received pulls awareness out of the body and into the room. The more attention you place on how you're landing, the less anchored you become in yourself. Others may not know why something feels off, but the body reads it as need. And need, when uncontained, erodes gravity. One of the most common expressions of this is over-explaining. Not teaching, not clarity, but explaining past the point of coherence. Filling silence with justification, adding context that wasn't asked for. From the inside, this feels like being thorough. From the nervous system's point of view, it's a plea for control. Clinicians hear this pattern often. Men who are intelligent, thoughtful, emotionally aware, yet repeatedly misunderstood. Not because their ideas lack value, but because the delivery is carrying a secondary message. Please stay with me while I say this. The key distinction matters here. This leakage is not character, it's adaptation. It developed to maintain connection in environments where connection felt uncertain, which is why it feels invisible to the person expressing it. You don't experience it as insecurity. You experience it as responsibility, as care, as effort to be understood. But the body doesn't translate effort as care. It translates regulation as safety. And when regulation is missing, even good intentions can feel heavy to receive. If this lands uncomfortably, there's no need to correct anything yet. Awareness alone begins to shift the system. 2 chapters from now, we'll place this pattern beside a real survivor account. One that reframes what quiet confidence actually means when the nervous system has been trained by inconsistency. For now, it's enough to notice this possibility gently, not as a flaw, but as a signal that the body learned something long before the mind named it. There is an old psychological distinction that appears in many traditions under different names. Jung would recognize it immediately, though he might describe it differently depending on the context. One mode of being negotiates its existence, the other assumes it. This is the difference between the pleaser and the sovereign. The pleaser moves first, adjusts quickly, explains motives, smooths edges before anyone asks. His attention flows outward, measuring the room, anticipating reactions, trying to stay aligned. From the inside, this feels considerate. From the psyche's point of view, it signals uncertainty about one's right to occupy space. The sovereign does something quieter. He does not rush to establish relevance. He does not negotiate his presence through output. His authority is not loud, because it is not provisional. It does not require confirmation to remain intact. This difference is often misunderstood as confidence versus shyness, or dominance versus passivity. But those comparisons miss the deeper mechanism. The psyche does not trust what chases. It trusts what remains. Much of what men label as being interesting is actually fear wearing a clever mask. Fear of rejection, fear of being dismissed, fear of becoming irrelevant in the silence. That fear then projects itself outward as activity. More words, more engagement, more expressive effort. The intent may be connection, but the signal is pursuit. Philosophically, Nietzsche criticized this long before modern psychology gave it language. Reactive behavior, in his view, is power that waits to be defined by something else. It responds, it adjusts, it depends. Initiating power, by contrast, does not need to chase meaning. It sets orientation simply by existing in coherence with itself. You can see this play out culturally, even in fiction. There is often a scene where multiple characters speak quickly, filling space, explaining themselves, asserting importance. And then there is one character who waits, who speaks last, whose words land with weight precisely because they were not rushed into the room. The difference is not intelligence or dominance, it is containment. For many men, silence triggers something deeper than discomfort. It triggers loss of control. Silence removes the ability to manage perception in real time. For men conditioned to earn safety through output, through humor, usefulness, or emotional labor, silence can feel like standing unarmed. This is why silence often feels dangerous, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being managed. Yet silence alone is not charisma. Withdrawal without coherence creates emptiness, not gravity. Silence works only when something organized is being held inside it. A regulated nervous system, a stable orientation, a sense of internal permission to exist without performing. When that coherence is present, silence stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like density, and that density is what the psyche responds to. Not because it is impressed, but because it feels safe. There is a moment in many men's inner lives when attraction stopped being about desire and quietly became about safety. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels necessary. When attention once equaled protection, absence did not feel neutral. It felt dangerous. This is the logic of the trauma bond. Not obsession, not weakness, adaptation. In early environments where attunement was inconsistent, the nervous system learned a simple equation. Being seen meant safety. Being unseen meant risk. Over time, attention itself became regulating. Its presence calmed the body. Its absence activated alarm. What matters here is not the story, but the physiology. Neuroscience helps clarify this without reducing it. Dopamine responds to anticipation and novelty. Oxytocin responds to consistency and bonding. Intermittent validation, attention that appears and disappears unpredictably, creates a powerful loop. The nervous system stays alert, scanning for the next signal of connection. Relief feels like chemistry. Calm feels unfamiliar. Across attachment research, this pattern appears again and again. Systems trained in inconsistency learn to associate intensity with closeness. Stability, by contrast, registers as flat, not because it lacks depth, but because the body hasn't learned to rest inside it yet. This is why some men report feeling most alive in interactions that keep them slightly anxious. A delayed reply, mixed signals, emotional volatility followed by brief warmth. The body relaxes momentarily, and that relief gets misinterpreted as attraction. One man described this clearly in a survivor account shared online. He believed he had finally found chemistry after years of disconnection. Conversations were electric. Silence felt unbearable. When contact resumed, his anxiety dropped sharply, and he felt bonded. Only later did he realize the calm he felt wasn't intimacy. It was relief. His nervous system had mistaken the end of threat for connection. This misreading is common, and it is not a personal failure. It is what happens when regulation has been outsourced to external attention for too long. Here is the reversal that often feels unsettling at first. Calm is not boring. It is unfamiliar to a dysregulated system. A regulated presence doesn't spike or crash. It doesn't flood or withdraw. It resolves. And for a system trained on unpredictability, that resolution can feel empty at first, like something is missing. What's missing is the alarm. At this midpoint, nothing needs to be fixed or reframed aggressively. Awareness itself begins to loosen the bond. There is value simply in noticing which interactions leave the body settled afterward, and which leave it stimulated, restless, or preoccupied, not as judgment, as information. Until this pattern is seen clearly, quiet behavior can feel like self-erasure rather than strength. Silence feels like abandonment, stillness feels like danger, and effort feels like care. But once the bond becomes visible, a different interpretation becomes possible. One where presence no longer depends on being noticed, and safety no longer depends on intensity. Stay with this. What comes next explains why some men become calmer and more magnetic after loss, not before. There is a quiet misunderstanding that runs through much of modern emotional culture. The belief that presence comes from expression, that authenticity requires display, that depth is proven by how much is shared, how quickly it is offered, and how visibly it moves others. From a Jungian lens, this confuses content with container. Content is what moves through us. Emotion, impulse, thought, sensation. The container is the inner structure that can hold those movements without being overwhelmed by them. Presence is not created by the amount of content expressed. It emerges from the strength and coherence of the container holding it. Many men were never taught this distinction. So emotional flooding gets mistaken for honesty. Reactivity gets mistaken for passion. Intensity gets mistaken for truth. Yet when emotion spills faster than it can be metabolized, the nervous system of everyone involved feels it as instability. Containment does not mean suppression. It means capacity. A useful image here is the blacksmith. Heat alone does nothing. Released freely, it burns and dissipates. But when heat is contained, held long enough, directed carefully, it reshapes metal. Form emerges not from force, but from disciplined holding. Masculine presence works the same way. When emotion is contained, it gains weight. When it leaks prematurely, it loses form. This is why slow response under pressure consistently registers as dominance across behavioral research. Not dominance as intimidation, but as stability. The ability to pause before reacting signals that the system is not hijacked, that something inside is steady enough to hold the moment without collapsing into urgency. For men who learned early that emotional expression was the only path to connection, containment can initially feel like withholding, like distance, like becoming cold. But the experience of others tells a different story. What they feel is not absence. It is safety. There is a subtle shift that happens when a man takes one internal anchor before speaking. Not a phrase, not an explanation. A physiological settling that happens inside the body first. Breath slows. Shoulders drop. Attention returns inward. Words follow from a regulated place, rather than racing ahead of it. This changes how others feel in his presence, often without them knowing why. Conversations slow down. Tension reduces. Trust increases. Not because he said the right thing, but because his nervous system wasn't asking anything of theirs. Containment is not about being less emotional. It is about being more organized. And this organization is what allows quiet behavior to carry weight rather than emptiness. It is what turns silence into density instead of withdrawal. It is also what prepares the ground for the final misunderstanding men often carry about charisma itself. There is a belief that sits quietly beneath much expressive behavior, rarely spoken aloud but often felt. The belief that if emotion is not made visible, connection will fade. That if inner states are not broadcast, relevance will be lost. That stillness risks disappearance. This belief is understandable. It often formed early, in environments where attention had to be maintained to feel secure. But it does not describe how human nervous systems actually relax around one another. From a biological perspective, safety is not built through intensity. It is built through resolution. Predictive safety explains this simply. Human systems calm down around patterns that complete themselves consistently, when responses are coherent, when tone matches content, when behavior resolves instead of oscillates. The nervous system stops scanning when it can predict the outcome without effort. This is why expressive volatility often creates fascination, but not trust. It stimulates attention, but it keeps the body alert. The system stays engaged because it cannot rest inside what comes next. Calm presence, by contrast, allows the body to downshift. It feels familiar after repetition, and familiarity, not novelty, is what signals safety. Philosophers noticed this long before neuroscience gave it language. Schopenhauer wrote about restraint, not as repression, but as intelligence, the capacity to hold impulse without acting on it immediately. Not because impulse is wrong, but because discernment requires space. This distinction matters. Restraint is not denial, it is timing. Across cultures, this understanding shows up clearly. In high-context societies, minimal expression often signals rank, not because emotion is absent, but because it is assumed to be contained. Meaning is carried by consistency, posture, pacing, and presence, rather than verbal emphasis. The less one needs to explain, the more authority is implied. In contrast, oversharing often emerges from fear of loss, fear that immediacy must be secured before the moment passes. So more is offered than the moment requires. Depth is rushed. Vulnerability is accelerated. Gravity is sacrificed for closeness. The paradox is that predictability does not flatten presence. It stabilizes it. When someone knows how you resolve, how you respond under pressure, how you hold boundaries, how your tone remains intact, their system relaxes. They stop bracing. Attention becomes voluntary instead of demanded. Predictability is not rigidity. It is integrity made observable. It is the quiet confidence that nothing essential will leak under stress, that the inner structure will hold, even when the moment does not ask for expression. And this is why charisma, at its core, is not expressive. It is reliable. What all of this points toward is a quieter integration. Charisma is not a technique layered onto personality. It is a byproduct of internal order. When the inner system is coherent, the outer signal organizes itself naturally. Nothing extra needs to be added. Quiet behaviors do not create attraction on their own. They remove interference. They clear the static that urgency, fear, and over-effort introduce into presence. What remains is something simpler and heavier, a steadiness others can feel without needing to name it. A single analogy holds this together. Charisma is like a well-tuned instrument. No extra notes, no unnecessary force, just resonance. The sound carries not because it is loud, but because it is clean. For many men, the turning point arrives quietly. It happens when the effort to be felt loosens and stability takes its place, when being grounded becomes more important than being noticed, when presence no longer asks the room to respond in order to feel whole. At that point, gravity returns, not because something new was learned, but because something old was released. If any part of this mapped onto your own experience, a single signal below is enough. No explanation, no story, just recognition. It often helps others notice the patterns sooner than they otherwise would.